Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO. We have a terrific lineup of in-person and live stream programs coming up this month and December, so please stay tuned for a quick update at the end of today's program. Also, we've kicked off our annual giving campaign to raise money to cover our operating expenses so that we can continue to bring you timely, quality programming. Please donate today so that we can continue to bring you this timely and important nonpartisan programming that helps connect you with the world. Help us promote global understanding and civic engagement, which is more important than ever in today's polarized environment, which is so timely with today's program. Welcome to the Dan Schnur Political Report that will be focusing on these very important 2022 midterms. Dan, it's time to bring you on and get to the meat of what's going on out there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim. And thanks, as always, for all of you who are joining us tonight. This is a special program, as Kim mentioned. And because we're going to be watching election results, at least for the next hour, and then I know you'll continue to watch them throughout the evening, we're going to do a slightly different format than usual tonight. In just a couple minutes, I'm going to run through some of the campaigns from the early states, the eastern states whose polls closed earlier this afternoon or have just closed at 5 o'clock Pacific time. And we'll be keeping an eye on those races as they develop over the next hour to see what early clues we can learn from them. Then we'll talk about what this all means and why it may be that it's turning out the way that it is. Third, we'll look ahead at ramifications for the future. And of course, then we'll come to your questions. But what we're going to do differently is rather than waiting until the bottom of the hour, rather than waiting until 5:30, which is normally the case, Rachel's going to join me in about 10 or 15 minutes, probably at about 5:15. And then together, she and I are going to keep an eye on the key campaigns as they develop over the course of the next hour. And so what I want to do before we get started is just give you a sense of those. There's all told roughly 20 states where the polls have either already closed, where the polls have closed either earlier or just now at 5 o'clock our time, 8 Eastern time. And we're certainly not going to try to keep up with all 20 of those states and all House and Senate and governor's campaigns in all of those states. But there's some in particular where the polls have closed, where I think it is helpful for us to pay some early attention to see what it might tell us about what the rest of the evening and the rest of the week's results are going to show us. Believe it or not, the first place in the country where the polls closed was the state of Indiana at 6 o'clock Eastern time, 3 o'clock our time. And the first district race there is actually what's considered by many experts to be a bellwether race. It's a northern Indiana district, very industrial, very populated by the type of Rust Belt voters that Trump won in 2016 and that Joe Biden took away from him 4 years later. And the incumbent Democrat there is a man by the name of Frank Nirvine. He's running for re-election in what's turned out to be a very close race against a Republican by the name of Jennifer Ruth Green. She's actually an African-American woman, one of many minority candidates and female candidates who Republicans are running across the country this year. About an hour ago, at 4 o'clock our time, at 7 o'clock Eastern, the polls closed in the state of Georgia. And of course, we'll be keeping a very close eye out. And if we see any results either from the governor's race between Kemp and Abrams or the Senate race between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker, we'll let you know about those right away, and then we'll talk about them. We'll also, from the states another state that closed at 7 o'clock is the state of Virginia, which did not have statewide races, but there are 3 incumbent Democrats, all women, who are facing very, very tightly contested re-election campaigns in that state, in the 2nd, 7th, and 10th congressional districts. And we'll be keeping an eye on those as we go forward also. At 7:30, just a little bit over half an hour ago, 7:30 Eastern time, 4:30 for us here in California, the polls closed in the state of North Carolina. And while the Senate race there looks to be leaning toward the Republicans, Representative Ted Budd, the Democrat Cheryl Beasley is running a very competitive race against him. And should she win that race, it would begin to look like a better night for Democrats than many have expected. There's a House race in North Carolina and another one in New Hampshire where the polls closed at that time. And we'll also be watching Ohio, where the polls closed at 4:30 California, 7:30 Eastern time, keeping an eye on that Senate race, where once again the Republicans seem to be favored with the author J.D. Vance. But he's facing a much tougher than expected campaign from Representative Ryan in that state. And then several states, 16 states, just had polls close a few minutes ago at 8 o'clock Eastern time. In Pennsylvania, where of course we'll be watching what may be the marquee event of the evening and perhaps of the week, the Senate race between Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and the television personality Mehmet Oz. That race, if all the other U.S. Senate campaigns around the country end up going according to the way the polls are now showing, which of course is not necessarily the case, but if in every other state, in every one of the other 33 Senate races other than this one, the polls are correct, then the Fetterman versus Oz campaign in Pennsylvania would decide control of the United States Senate. And while we haven't seen any calls out of Pennsylvania yet, and probably won't until late tonight or perhaps even later this week, some of the exit polls that the networks have been showing indicate an electorate that is leaning toward Fetterman. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later also. So that's not a prediction. We're not going to be bold enough to predict an outcome, at least not yet. But the exit polls that ask voters about their opinions on the issues and other considerations that drive their vote do seem to be leaning a little bit toward the Democratic side in Pennsylvania. There's an important House race there, yet another heavily industrial district. This is the 8th district in Western Pennsylvania, where the incumbent Democrat is running against a Republican challenger. Also at 5 o'clock, 8 Eastern time, the polls closed in Florida. And while both Ron DeSantis is expected to win re-election as governor, and maybe not by quite as large a margin, Senator Marco Rubio is expected to win re-election as well. We'll watch those races closely too, because if either one of them ends up being closer than expected, that also might give Democrats some reason for encouragement. Even if they come up short in Florida, it might mean that the Republican wave that so many are expecting tonight might not be quite as big as many are forecasting. Important House races in New Hampshire, in Connecticut, in Maine, in Rhode Island, in each place where there's an incumbent Democrat running against a more difficult challenger than expected from the Republicans. Keep in mind that right now, there are no House seats in the entire region of New England, in that entire 6-state region. There are no House seats held by Republicans, 0. U.S. Senator Susan Collins in Maine is the only federal elected official who's a Republican from any of those states. But 4 key races in New England, all in states whose polls closed just a few minutes ago. And we'll be watching other House races as well on the East Coast, in New Jersey, as I mentioned earlier, in Florida and elsewhere. So lots to keep an eye on. And when Rachel joins me in a few minutes, if any of these results do come in and there are any early calls, we'll not only tell you about them, but we'll reflect on them. We'll reflect on them as well. Now, moving forward just a little bit on a broader scale before we come back to the individual races. In my mind, the most important aspect of the 2022 midterm election campaigns is the mood of the voters. And the American people, as all of you know, from what you read, from what you see, and perhaps from what you yourself feel, is American voters are profoundly unhappy. They're extremely dissatisfied with their political leadership in both parties. But as we've talked about before, the party in charge, the party that holds the presidency, generally does end up getting the lion's share of that unhappiness and that resentment. And we'll talk a little bit more going forward about the depths of that unhappiness. But before we do, I'm going to ask you, or more accurately, I'm going to ask Katie to to post a couple of questions for you. Questions that have been asked by national polls in the last week or two. These two questions come from NBC national polls, and I'll be interested in seeing how our group responds to these questions, and then we can compare them to the national responses. So Katie, can we go up with our first question? What do you think? Can we put that up? Okay, so let's look at that. Question number one, how do you regard the other party? And we're not going to ask you in this whether you're a Democrat or Republican. That's obviously something that's your own business. But this is a question for anyone, regardless of their party affiliation. Would you say that you disagree with the other party, but that they want many of the same things I do? Would you say second, a little bit more strongly, well, I'd oppose many of their decisions, but these things can be corrected. If the other side wins and they make some decisions and make some changes, we can always fix that 2 years or 4 years later when my party gets back in charge. Third, ratcheting it up even a little bit further, you thinking about the other party, whether that other party be Republicans or Democrats, do you think, well, they would make bad decisions, and those bad decisions would harm our country in a significant way? And then fourth, and most pronounced, would you say that you agree with the following statement? Their agenda, the Democratic agenda or the Republican agenda, your opponent's agenda, their agenda would destroy our country as we know it. So starting with sort of a mild disagreement, but realizing there's common ground, and then escalating up step by step to saying, if the other side wins and implements our agenda, our country as we know it will absolutely be destroyed, a catastrophic, apocalyptic response. So Katie, how did our group respond to this? What did we hear back from them? Well, look at those responses. Really interesting. 49%, almost half of you, said that the other side would make bad decisions that would harm our country. 34% said the other party's agenda would destroy our country as we know it. And smaller percentages of you took the more mild approaches. Yeah, I'd oppose their decisions, but these things can be corrected in time, 10%. And 8%, well, I disagree with them, but they're good people. But that 34%, their agenda would destroy our country as we know it. That seems like a pretty high number, doesn't it? Well, when NBC asked exactly the same question of voters across the country, 80%, 80, more than 3/4 of their respondents said that the other party's agenda would destroy our country as we know it. This was a bipartisan feeling. 79% of Republicans felt that the Democratic agenda would destroy our country. 81% of Democrats thought the Republican agenda would destroy our country as we know it. So our group's actually somewhat more measured than the NBC poll was. And I find that very interesting. But Katie, if we can, let's put up another question. Okay, this one's a little bit more straightforward. What's the primary motivator for your vote? I'm guessing that anyone who's joining us tonight probably did take the time to vote today or to mail in their ballot or drop off their ballot in the days or weeks previous. So what was the thing that made you want to vote more than anything else? Number one, was it because I believe in my party and our principles? In other words, you voted because of your strong support for your party's candidates and their goals. Or second, your primary motivation was not strong belief in favor of your own party, but opposition to the other party. Option number two, I want to stop the other party from having control. So were you motivated by positive thoughts about your own party? Were you motivated by negative or angry thoughts about the other party? Or third, finally, both equally? And how do we do on this one, Katie? What does our survey show us? 58% said both equally, but for those of you who did pick one or the other, not much of a difference. 23% were motivated primarily by wanting to stop the other side from having control, and 19% said they voted primarily for positive reasons. So it's not exactly even, pretty close and within the margin of error. And once again, what I'll tell you is the American electorate seems to be much more frustrated and much more angry than our group is, because almost 2/3 of the American people said that their main reason for voting was because of anger or fear of the other party's agenda. So I know that our group isn't always satisfied when we talk about these things, but it does seem like we're a little bit calmer than the country as a whole. And that's something that should give us all pause going forward, because regardless of whether Republicans reclaim their majority tonight or whether Democrats are able to hold or expand theirs, regardless of whether Joe Biden runs for another 4 years and succeeds in holding the Oval Office, whether another Democrat runs to replace him, or whether a Republican takes the White House back in 2024. Regardless, these emotions, these really deep feelings, they're not going away. And this anger, this frustration, this unhappiness, this polarization is something that, for those of you who've been with us in the past, you know, it's something I talk about quite a bit because it's something of great concern to me. And regardless of the outcome of this midterm elections or the presidential elections to follow it, it really is something that we're going to need to continue to talk about. And again, regardless of who's in charge, come to some kind of decisions about how we can move forward in a more cohesive and less confrontational way. So we're at about quarter after the hour, and I'm going to ask Rachel to come on screen if you can. How are you,
Hi,
Rachel?
Dan. Good. How are you?
Good. Great to see you.
Good to see you too. I wanted to start by giving you the update that they have called the Florida race for governor for DeSantis.
Okay. And it's probably a little bit early to see margins, but as the evening goes on, knowing that DeSantis was a very, very strong favorite for re-election and a potential candidate for president 2 years from now, it's not surprising that he won. But what I would encourage our group to do is keep an eye on the margins, because if DeSantis does end up winning, but with a percentage in the high 50s, or even as close to 60%, then that means that Florida, not only does that mean that Florida is becoming less of a purple and more of a deep red state, but it does suggest that as we go across the country over the course of the evening, this could be a particularly strong night for Republicans. So not a surprise that DeSantis has been reelected, but let's keep an eye on those numbers as they go forward. Any other calls you've seen so far, Rachel?
That's the only official one so far. CNN predicts that Marco Rubio will also win in Florida for Senate. And we're keeping an eye as the other results are coming in.
Okay, excellent. So Rachel will stay on screen with me. And we'll go to your questions in just a few minutes, a little bit earlier than we normally do, because we want to make sure to get in more of your questions tonight. And we also recognize that if some results do come in the second half of the hour, we are going to be interrupting that a little bit. But before we begin the questions, just a couple of other reminders, things we've talked about in the past, which hopefully everyone can keep in mind as the night and as the week goes on. So the Senate, of course, is tied 50-50. And Vice President Harris for the last 2 years has been casting the tie-breaking vote, giving Democrats an official majority, but only by the very slimmest of margins. In the House, the Democrats have a 5-seat margin, and Republicans, while we're not making a prediction, Republicans are heavily favored to regain control of the House. A little bit of background on that. In 2020, Joe Biden won 14 congressional districts that are currently held by Republican members of the House of Representatives. And there were 9 districts that elected Democratic House members that Trump won. So in other words, if a Democrat wins every single seat that Biden won 2 years ago, and if a Republican House candidate wins every single seat that Trump won 2 years ago, well, that means Democrats will actually expand their majority a little bit. But what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is that in most of the seats that Trump won narrowly, in almost all of them, both sides have, for the most part, all but pulled their advertising, recognizing that those seats are most likely to turn Republican. And what has become the most competitive state of play in the House of Representatives are not the districts that Biden won by 5 points or by a very small margin, but rather seats that Biden carried by 10 to 15 points are those being most heavily contested between the two parties. And so again, that doesn't predict outcomes, but what it does tell us is that both parties believe that seats that voted for Trump are almost certainly going to go Republican this year. And that a lot of those districts that Biden carried narrowly in 2020 are more likely than not to go Republican as well. Now, as we've talked about before, ultimately, much more in the House races than the Senate, but really across the board, midterm elections are all about turnout. Presidential elections, as we know, are primarily about persuading swing voters. Both national parties in their presidential campaigns in presidential years spend an immense amount of their time and resources and energy trying to convince that middle portion of the electorate to move in one direction or the other. But because midterm elections get lower levels of voting, what that means is because turnout is less, it means that those undecided voters in the middle of the spectrum, they're less likely to turn out. So what we've seen this year, as we see in most midterm elections, is much more of an effort to both parties, on the part of both parties, to turn out their bases. For Republicans, that means older voters. It means religious voters. For Democrats, it means young voters, it means voters from underrepresented minority communities. And in particular, the discussion over abortion rights is one that the Democrats strongly believed for most of the summer and fall would turn out their base, particularly young people, particularly young women, to turn out on the question of abortion rights, given the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade back in June. In the last week or two, we've begun to see Democrats, many Democrats, coming to the conclusion that abortion rights is not the motivating issue that they expected it would be. And we've seen Democrats from Joe Biden on down begin to talk less about abortion rights and to talk more about economic issues and more about democracy, trying to find another way to motivate voters. And so again, we're certainly not going to make predictions on tonight's outcome, but it is worth assuming, and it's not worth assuming, it's worth noting that generally speaking, when one side or the other is doing well, they generally have to stay with their strategy. And the fact that the Democrats have been altering their message in the last week, 10 days, 2 weeks, suggests some concern on their part that the strategy they'd been employing in the months up until now hadn't been nearly as effective as they thought it was going to be. So there are just over between 30 and 35 seats in the House that are considered to be toss-ups. If Democrats hold every single one of those, they will maintain a very slim majority in the House of Representatives. Every single toss-up race would need to go to the Democrats for the most part, for them to hold the majority. If they split, then that gives Republicans a small majority. But the more of those seats the Republican wins, the larger the Republican House majority would become. Rachel, how are we doing in terms of questions coming in? Are we getting any yet?
Yeah, we have several questions if you want to move to questions now. And I also wanted to let you know that both CNN and the AP have called the Florida Senate race for Marco Rubio.
Okay, so once again, not a surprise. We knew going forward that Rubio was the favorite. That said, Val Demings, the Democratic candidate, the House member from Northern Florida, who's the former police chief of her city, was considered to be positioned to mount a somewhat more competitive campaign against Rubio than Charlie Crist, the Democratic candidate for governor, was against DeSantis. So had Demings been able to pull this race out, that would have that would have forecast a very good night for Democrats nationally. This doesn't necessarily mean a bad night, but two elections that have both been called pretty much on the status quo. So no surprises there. And I think most of those people who are expecting Republican gains tonight and this week are almost certainly still expecting them. So how are we doing? Why don't we start questions? And then maybe what we can do, Rachel, is after we've answered a couple questions, is Katie and I can throw out a couple poll questions back at our audience so they can still participate.
Perfect. So our first question is, have the pundits underestimated the 18 to 25 voter turnout, and what potential impact will they have on the results?
A really smart question. And it goes back to a point I was just starting to address a moment ago, which is the importance for both parties of turning out their bases in a lower turnout midterm election. And Democrats, in addition to voters from minority communities, rely very, very heavily on young voters. Make no mistake about it. If young people turn out at the same level tonight or this week that they did in 2018, then the Democrats will actually maintain their majorities in Congress. But most early forecasts suggest a much lower turnout among young people. And in early voting, in mail voting in many states, the percentage of early votes that have come in from 18 to 25-year-olds is a much smaller percentage than it was in either 2018 or 2020. So we don't know yet, to answer the question. We don't yet know whether the forecasters underestimated or overestimated youth turnout. But if the Democrats are going to keep their majorities, it is going to be because the premise of the questioners that the question raised was correct. If young people do turn out in larger numbers than expected, that is the Democrats' best chance. But at this early point in the evening, we simply don't know yet.
Great. And not an update, but just wanted to say that the Georgia governor's race is extremely close right now with only 41% of the vote in. Stacey Abrams is leading by about 0.4%, so very tight.
Okay, so 2 points to make there before we go to the next question. One, Brian Kemp, the incumbent Republican governor of Georgia, is favored to win re-election. And so the fact that he was not considered to be nearly as strong a favorite as DeSantis or Rubio in Florida. But most prognosticators were looking at him as the likely victor. The fact that this race is running so close, with not a majority of the vote in yet, but a plurality, that's somewhat encouraging for Democrats. And I want to emphasize somewhat encouraging, because it's worth remembering that in Georgia, like many other states, Donald Trump and other Republicans have been discouraging their supporters from voting by mail. And so the fact that the Georgia numbers are this close might end up being a little bit misleading. We don't know from what parts of the state the votes have come in, but the fact that it is a close race with more than 40% of the vote in is something that should give Democrats some encouragement going forward into the evening.
Great. So our next question is, if election deniers gain a foothold tonight, what impact might that have on the elections in 2024?
Well, this is precisely the point that President Biden has been making for the last couple of weeks. As I mentioned earlier, for a long time, for most of the summer and fall, Biden Democrats looked at the abortion issue in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision as the best way of motivating their base. Most public opinion polls show that the kind of question that you just read, Rachel, is not something that preoccupies a great deal of voters. Biden feels it is such an important one that he gave a fairly major primetime speech last week, not about abortion rights, not about inflation, but about the state of democracy, warning voters about this. And there's a significant number of voters and political leaders in both parties who are worried that if someone is elected to a position of responsibility, say as Secretary of State in Arizona or in Nevada, or even as governor in the state of Pennsylvania, if an active election denier, somebody who refuses to recognize the results of the 2020 election, is elected to that office, it's entirely possible that that person will end up misusing their state's political apparatus in 2024. As we've talked about before in this webinar, and as you know, Rachel, this is a topic that concerns me, but it's not one that worries me to the degree that it does many other people. And the reason for that is because, as we saw in 2020, and as we've seen in the run-up to this year's election, the separation of powers that is part of our Constitution does provide levels of protection against an individual rogue operator trying to misuse the election apparatus for their own purposes or for their party's political purposes. We've already seen the courts weigh in very aggressively in advance of this election on questions of election monitoring. We saw the same in 2020. We see different levels of government, local, state, and federal, all having different roles in this process. So while one individual elected to office who is determined to thwart the will of the voters in their state by attempting to overturn an election. While that is something that should concern us, and it does concern most Americans, I do believe, because of the nature of the way our election's set up, there are built-in protections that don't make that kind of malfeasance impossible, but make it much more difficult. It's not nearly as simple as one elected official stealing away an election in the dead of night.
Thank you for that, Dan. So our next question is, there are several states with anti-slavery ballot propositions. Any idea what's happening with those propositions?
Okay. There hasn't been a great deal of reliable polling on many of these initiatives. And here in California, of course, the ballot initiative generally tends to dominate the ballot this year more than other, because we don't have a competitive campaign for governor or for Senate. But usually these initiatives normally don't get nearly as much attention over the course of a campaign. And on issues like these, it's understandable, because while these are critically important issues, they're less directly impactful to the daily lives of most voters. If most people go to the polls because they're concerned about inflation or concerned about their jobs, because they're concerned about abortion from either a pro-choice or pro-life position, these types of things have a real direct resonance for a much larger number of voters than initiatives on the types of topics that you're talking about. It doesn't mean they're not important. It means they're probably not going to get the kind of attention they deserve because so much else is happening on the ballot. One thing I'd like to do, if we can, Rachel, before we go to the next question from the audience, is I want to talk a little bit about what comes next. And once again, we're not predicting outcomes tonight. As I've said earlier, most expectations are that Republicans will gain seats in both the House and the Senate, but we're a long way from knowing whether that's the case or not. And that primarily is a turnout question. But looking ahead, whether Democrats maintain fairly small majorities or whether Republicans happen to achieve them, the most likely outcome in Congress or in Washington over the next couple of years is gridlock. President Biden, even with very small Democratic majorities, was able to achieve several of his legislative priorities over the last 2 years. If Republicans do win even a small majority, that's much, much less likely for the second 2 years of his term. And of course, and we can talk more later tonight or on November 8th, next Thursday, November 17th. Is that right, Rachel? We're doing our special version. We're doing our extra version.
That's right.
But we're going to set aside some time on November 17th to talking about what's going to happen in Washington over the next 2 years. But we also want to talk about what's going to happen 2 years from now in 2024. Donald Trump has already made it clear that he intends to announce his campaign for re-election as early as next week. And President Biden, very interestingly, is currently not scheduled to hold a news conference tomorrow, traditionally the day after a midterm election, whether the president's party wins seats or loses seats. The president will meet with reporters, with journalists, and talk with them about how they believe the election results will affect that president's governing agenda and priorities for the next 2 years. Biden might change his mind, but right now he does not have a news conference scheduled, and he is scheduled to leave the country on Thursday for Egypt for a climate change conference. So we don't know what's going to happen in 2024. Trump says he's going to run. Biden has made it clear that he, in all likelihood, intends to, but has said that with less certainty. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about this in the future, but now seems like as good a time as any for our group. So let's get their sense on 2024. So Katie, can I ask you to put up our next question? Okay. Who do you think, group, who do you think will be the Republican nominee for president in 2024? Unfortunately, as I think I've explained to you in the past, our software only allows us to put up 5 options. So we weren't able to put up nearly as many possibilities as actually currently exist. But right now, at least, we decided to offer you the choice of Donald Trump, of Governor DeSantis, who we were just talking about a minute or two ago, Mike Pence, the former vice president, who does seem pretty clearly intent on running whether Trump runs or not, and also Donald Trump's former United Nations ambassador, the former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, or someone else. So knowing that there's still some time to go, but knowing that Trump is planning to announce for re-election in roughly a week, question for our group is, which one of these candidates do you think is most likely to be the Republican nominee? Not your personal choice, but your prediction. Who do you think? And Katie, how do we do on our responses? Okay. Well, little surprise there, not much surprise. Donald Trump gets the most support in this regard, 47%. Almost half of our respondents pick him, but Ron DeSantis at 40% is not that far behind. And that does reflect trending in national poll numbers, overall poll numbers, and poll results among Republican voters. DeSantis has been gradually making up ground on this question over the last several months, to the point when Trump was out on the campaign trail in Ohio several days ago. His campaign, or his team, posted poll results showing him far ahead of the rest of the field. But on closer examination, it turned out that those poll results were several months old. It looked like Trump's advisors didn't want to put up numbers that were this close. Pence and Haley way down toward in single digits. Same with someone else, but 47-40. That's a remarkably close margin. I think much closer than many of us would have predicted 6 months ago. So Katie, in the interest of partisan fairness, let's ask our group what they think about the Democratic side. What do you think? Okay. So for our Democratic options, of course, Joe Biden, because he has indicated that he does intend to run for re-election. But we are hearing growing whispers in Democratic circles that particularly if Democrats do have a very difficult midterm election, there might be increased pressure on Biden to step aside. And if he did, then the question becomes who would replace him. And once again, if we could do it, if we had the technology to do it, we'd put 10, 15, 20 names up here, but we're limited to 5. So if Biden were to decide not to run, what do you think? Let's assume for the sake of argument that none of these Democrats are going to run against Biden should he choose to seek re-election. But which of these do you think is most likely to be the Democratic nominee? Will Biden run again? Or alternatively, do you think that either Vice President Harris or Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, or Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, might be picked? And then once again, there's a room for someone else, everyone from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren to Cory Booker to Beto O'Rourke to dozens of other Democrats who would probably consider getting in the race if Biden chose not to run. But once again, let's see what our group thinks about this. Now that's really interesting. Those are some of the most interesting figures I've seen from our group in a long time. Only 25%, Rachel, only 25% of our group thinks that Biden will be the Democratic nominee for president 2 years from now. 31% predict Gavin Newsom. I suspect we have a pretty heavy California skew to our audience, and as I know we do draw audience members from other parts of the country, but we'll assume that's a pretty heavy California contingent. 15% say Pete Buttigieg, which is a pretty healthy number. Most secretaries of transportation don't get that kind of consideration for president. Only 4% of our respondents believe that Kamala Harris will be the Democratic nominee for president. In some ways, that's an even more noteworthy outcome than Biden's numbers. Harris is the vice president. Normally, if a president chooses not to seek re-election, it's their VP who steps in their stead. But only 4% say Harris. If you add up the two, that's 29%, which is a little bit less than Gavin Newsom and only slightly more than someone else. Okay. All right, Rachel, we've had our fun. Let's get back to questions from our group. What do you think?
That sounds great, Dan. Not an official call yet, but I just wanted to let you know that the races for Virginia's 2nd and 10th congressional districts are extremely close, and I think getting close to a call. So I will keep you updated on that. Sorry, 7th congressional district is extremely close. 2nd is not as close.
And the second one, the 2nd district, I believe, which is, hold on one second here. I'm sorry, you said this, the 7th and the 10th are closer.
Yes.
and that the
Sorry, I was-
second district in Virginia is not.
Right.
Now, again, just to remind everyone of our conversation at the beginning of the program tonight, there are 3 heavily contested House seats in the state of Virginia. And the reason we're paying so much attention to them now is because the polls closed in Virginia at 4 o'clock California time, 7 o'clock Eastern. And what Rachel is telling me is that Elaine Luria, who represents the second congressional district in Virginia, is looking at this point like a good bet for re-election. Is that right, Rachel? Is that right, Rachel?
So actually, with 54% of the vote in, the AP is reporting that Jen Kiggins, her opponent, is at 55.9% of the vote.
Oh my goodness. All right. So this is a much different outcome. Again, we don't know from where in the district these votes are coming, whether they're coming from urban or rural areas, whether they're coming in by mail or in election day voting. But the fact that the incumbent Democrat, Luria, is running so far behind her Republican challenger does not bode well. It doesn't mean she's going to lose, because we really don't have a good sense of where the votes are coming from yet. But that is actually a somewhat troublesome sign for Democrats' prospects in the House of Representatives. And then in the 7th and 10th district, it sounds like both Abigail Spanberger in the 7th Virginia district and in Virginia's 10th congressional district, Jennifer Wexton, incumbents, are both involved in very close races. So once again, this is early, but once we go off in about 20 minutes from now, I'd encourage you to keep an eye on those 3 races, because even though it's only 3 House races out of 435, because the polls closed so early in Virginia, we're probably going to get a better sense early in the evening of those outcomes than we are races in the Central and the Mountain and the Pacific time zones. So we'll keep an eye on those going forward. Thanks for the update, Rachel.
Of course. So heading back to our audience questions, the next one is, please provide thoughts you have on any potential election challenges that we've heard about today in Maricopa County, Arizona.
Okay. For those of you who have not seen the news, Maricopa County, Arizona, it's the county in which Phoenix is located, and roughly half of Arizona's voters have had immense problems with their voting machines. And in fact, 20% of the voting machines in Arizona's largest county have been malfunctioning over the course of the day. Immediately, Donald Trump and some of his supporters began charging foul play. They believe that because the Democratic nominee for governor in Arizona, Katie Hobbs, is the sitting Secretary of State, that there's some intentional wrongdoing going on there. The election officials, though, at the local level in Maricopa County have assured the public that these are technical glitches. There's no intentional problems arising, and they've been setting up alternative ways for voters in Phoenix and the surrounding area to cast their ballot. So because we already knew we were going to see very, very significant election challenges around the country in the days and weeks ahead, let's assume now that those challenges in Arizona are going to be even more heated than they were before. So again, lots of charges of bad faith actors, but at least the election officials themselves say these are technical issues that are in the process of being corrected and will not preclude anybody from casting a vote and having that vote accurately counted.
Great. So we've gotten a few questions about campaign finance. So one of our audience members asked, can you explain dark money and how much of a factor you believe it has on these races and who it favors, Republicans or Democrats?
Okay. So many of you are familiar with the term dark money, but it also gets interpreted in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people looking to achieve a lot of different goals. So if you contribute money as an individual, as a corporation, as a labor union, if you contribute money to a candidate running for office, you are required to publicly disclose that contribution. Excuse me, the campaign is publicly required to disclose that contribution. And so after a certain turnaround period, all contributions to candidate campaigns for federal, state, and local office are a matter of public record. But when you contribute money to an independent committee, not all independent committees, but many are set up in a way that they do not require disclosure of campaign contributions. And for the most part, and there's exceptions to this, for the most part, if an independent committee is set up in a way that it cannot and does not advocate directly for the election or defeat of a candidate, that committee is not required to disclose its donations. And those contributions can come in not only privately and secretly, but at unlimited levels. So you might only be able to give a few $1,000s to a candidate for office in your community. But Rachel, if you decided you wanted to, you could give millions of dollars to one of these independent committees. And because that money is both unlimited and unreported, it gives many people, myself included, great concern about interests who are trying to purchase an election without the voters understanding who or what affected that election's outcome. Who benefits more from dark money? That's a harder question. It was assumed for some years that Republicans generally tended to do better with these unlimited, undisclosed contributions. But as the years have passed, Democrats have gotten pretty talented at it also. And so I'm going to weasel out of the answer and say this is really a case-by-case basis, depending on the individual campaign and depending on the level of interest for one side or the other. Either Republican or Democratic interests can take advantage of this secret giving, but there's not an established rule across the board that one party is either more effective or more nefarious than the other at doing it anymore.
On a related note, another audience member asked, could you speak to Democrats spending quite a bit on Republican candidates and how that could possibly backfire?
But this is a gamble that Democrats have taken in a number of races around the country for House, for Senate, and for governor. They looked around the country and saw a number of very committed Trump supporters running in Republican primaries against more traditional mainstream conservatives. Democrats decided in those races that defeating a more extreme Republican in a general election would be an easier win than running against a more mainstream candidate. And so what we saw in several races around the country is we saw Democrats donating money and providing other types of support to the more ideologically extreme Republican candidates in order to create a more favorable general election matchup. Now, in most of the places where that's been done, their plan is working out just fine. The more extreme from their purposes, from their standpoint, the more extreme Republican won the primary and is getting walloped likely to get walloped in the general election. For example, the campaign for governor of Pennsylvania, where the more extreme candidate, Doug Mastriano, became the party nominee, and it looks like he's going to lose the general election campaign to the Democratic Attorney General Josh Shapiro by a pretty convincing margin. And that's been the case in most of these races. But there are a number of House races around the country where it now looks like the more extreme Republican candidate is running a competitive race against the Democrat. And there were a lot of Democrats at the time, including former Democratic House Leader Dick Gephardt, who said he hardly disapproved of his party supporting Republican election deniers in order to achieve a competitive advantage, making the argument that Gephardt and other Democrats said, see, basically you're putting these potentially dangerous people in a position where they can get elected. And if you're that concerned about the future of democracy, then why would you put it at risk for the sake of a marginal partisan advantage? One race in particular, where this is a very important question and is very much unresolved, is in the US Senate race in the state of New Hampshire. In the state of New Hampshire, most of the state's Republican establishment, including the governor, Republican Governor Chris Sununu, and most of the nation's Republican establishment, including Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, supported a more mainstream traditional Republican candidate. The candidate who ultimately won the nomination with considerable Democratic support, a retired general by the name of Don Bolduc, has at different times in the campaign expressed very, very strong election denial tendencies and is just supported very strongly by former President Trump. As recently as a month ago, it looked like the Democratic plan was working just fine, and that the incumbent Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan was going to win a safe victory over Bolduc, rather than having a more competitive campaign against a more traditional Republican. But as the election day has gotten closer, the polls have gotten closer too. And over the last several days, Bolduc, the Republican challenger, has pulled within the margin of error in the state of New Hampshire. And while Democratic incumbent Maggie Hassan is still a slight favorite, the potential for not just a Republican candidate to win, but a more extreme election denier type to win has risen considerably. And if Bolduc were to get elected to the Senate, it would be not the only, but would almost certainly be the most visible example of that Democratic strategy backfiring. So the question is, how badly do you want to win, even if it means affecting the other party's primary? When the gamble pays off, just fine. But there's some anxious Democrats in New Hampshire and elsewhere around the country now, keeping a very close eye on the Hassan versus Bolduc count.
So heading back to 2024 for a minute, this audience member asked, will Trump's current multitude of legal battles in New York, Georgia, etc., have an effect on his desire to run for president again?
It's a really interesting question. And it's entirely possible that the various legal challenges that Trump faces will not discourage him from running, but will encourage him to run. As although these cases are proceeding in local and state court as well, the legal proceedings, the potential legal proceedings of greatest concern to Trump has been the U.S. Justice Department investigation in his presidency, particularly the events of January 6th, even more so, the confidential documents that he took with him when he left the White House. Now, the Justice Department goes to great lengths to avoid looking like they're taking sides in partisan politics. And so as a result of that, the Justice Department will almost never file charges against a candidate or a significant political player in the weeks before an election, so as to avoid impacting that election's outcome. There's a lot of speculation in Washington that the U.S. Department of Justice is ready to file charges against Trump, but hasn't done so because doing it right before the midterms could be interpreted as them taking sides politically. And now that Trump says that he might announce for re-election as soon as next week, what he's essentially done is shrunk the window available to the Justice Department to file charges against him. Because if filing charges before a midterm election would make them look partisan, filing charges against an announced presidential candidate of the opposite party than the current president would look very partisan as well. Now, there is a lot of speculation that Attorney General Merrick Garland will appoint a special counsel to look into Trump's activities in an effort to separate the Justice Department and the Biden administration from these proceedings. But make no mistake about it, if Donald Trump is an announced candidate for president, whether a week or a month or a year from now, then these types of proceedings become much more difficult to move forward. So I know it would seem logical that legal challenges might prevent someone from running for office. In this case, they might actually make a Trump candidacy even more likely.
So I think we have time for one more question, Dan.
Okay.
So this audience member asked, Dan, what do you suggest individuals like us who care about the polarization in this country can do in our small parts of the world? So much has been written about it, but very little about what we can do.
Boy, that's such a great question. And I think it's a perfect question to close out tonight's conversation. Because elections, midterm or otherwise, are definitionally a partisan activity. And of course, they should be a partisan activity. Two or more parties debating the issues of the day, and ultimately one or the other receiving more support to move forward with their agenda toward their goals. That's the way it's supposed to work. But as I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's program, regardless of the outcome of these midterm elections, what we see going forward, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic Congress, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, is we see an American electorate, American people that are extraordinarily polarized, divided, and angry. And so when the questioner asks what we can do, the way I interpret that question is not what can we do, Dan, to make sure our side wins, but what can we do to lower that level of anger, to make that level of distrust somewhat less omnipresent, and to get to a point where fewer Americans, rather than more, see the other party as a menace to our country and our democracy as we know it. There's all sorts of things that can be done on a grand scale, but not just locally, but individually. I would say that either you yourself or an organization that you're part of, even if it's a book club, some type of community group, a neighborhood cleanup, whatever it happens to be, either you individually or as part of a group to which you belong, find a way to reach out to someone or a group with whom you disagree. If you're a Democrat, reach out to a Republican. If you're a Republican, you and your fellow book club members do some looking around online and find a book club for Democrats and reach out to them and have a conversation. Ultimately, the breach that we talk about, the divisiveness, the polarization, it's not going to be solved in the US House or the US Senate. It's not going to be solved in a presidential election. It's going to be solved when Americans, people like you and me and our questioner, Rachel, decide, hey, instead of looking at someone who disagrees with me as the enemy, as someone evil or dangerous, I'm going to look at them as a reasonably good person who just has a different idea of how we ought to confront some of our community's problems. And even if we're not going to convince each other, we're going to at least make an effort to have conversations. So when it comes down to vote in 2 years, even if we vote for two different candidates, we can still talk to each other with a level of regard and respect. And whether it's something you do just as an individual human being, or whether it's something you do with a few friends or book club members, I think ultimately that's the way we put this back together and not necessarily eliminate the anger and divisiveness, but at least reduce it to a level where it's more manageable. I know you said we were just about out of time, Rachel, but if I can ask Katie to put up our fifth question. Okay, we've asked you this question last month in October, and we asked you the month before in September, so we're going to ask you one last time. What do you think will be the outcome of tonight's Senate elections? Will it be a large Democratic majority, a small Democratic majority, a small Republican majority, or a large Republican majority? And just to remind you, our definitions here is we'll call a small majority for Democrats or Republicans 51 or 52 seats. If one party or the other gets 53 seats or more, we'll call that a large majority for the Democrats or Republicans. So let's see what we get, and let's see how it compares to what we've done in the past. 1% say large Democratic majority, 38% more, so a total of almost 40% think there'll be a Democratic majority of some type. 62% say either a small or a large Republican majority. And when we've asked this question previously, the numbers have leaned pretty much in the other direction. So over the last couple months, our group at least has become increasingly convinced that Republicans will control Congress, but at least on these results, by a relatively small number. And so real quick, Katie, let's put up our last question and see what our group thinks about the House results, or the potential House results. Same question for everyone. What will be the outcome of tonight's House elections? Will there be a large Democratic majority? We'll say arbitrarily more than 10 seats or so. A small Democratic majority, roughly of its current size, between 1 and 10 seats. Will there be a small Republican majority of 10 seats or less? Or will there be a large Republican majority of 10 seats or more? And once again, we'll compare these to the numbers that you've offered us in the past. So what do we got for this one, Katie? 56% say a small Republican majority, and other 30% say a large Republican majority. 86% think that Republicans will control the House in January. 15% say that the Democrats will. Last time we did this, the numbers still leaned Republican, but when you combine the small and large majorities, it came out to 57%. Now it's up at 86%. So even more in the House than in the Senate, Rachel. Over the last month or two, our group isn't necessarily voting Republican, but is much more likely to predict Republican majorities. Last point before Kim comes back on is to remind all of you that we don't have election day anymore. we have election month. And a lot of these key races that we've been talking about tonight are not going to be decided tonight. It's going to be days, in some cases even weeks, before we see the election outcomes. So by all means, stay up late tonight and watch the results as they come in. But know that it's much more likely than not that it'll be later this week or next week, or maybe even early December, before we have final results and know what our elected representative makeup is going to be for 2023 and 2024. Rachel, thanks as always for a terrific job, not only handling the questions, but also keeping an eye on election results. So thank you very much for pulling double duty.
Thank you, Dan.
Pat, and thanks as well to Katie, who stays off screen but does great work on our questionnaires. And Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Dan, thank you for such an important and thoughtful discussion. And I'll just point out that reluctantly, we're not having your post-program discussion just because we know everyone will be tuned in to whatever the breaking developments are. A big thank you to Rachel and Katie. They do such a great job. Thanks, everyone. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. See you in a couple weeks.